Everybody occasionally has to make snap judgments that might be quite upsetting. Physicians frequently have to make difficult choices that might spell the difference between life and death. On his first meeting with Lanny and Laura Bryson, Dr. Tim Malone would have a very memorable moment when faced with such a dilemma. After nearly 10 years of marriage, Angela and Richard Bryson were finally expecting their first child. They intended to establish a family after 3 years of marriage, but sadly, Angela was never able to conceive. Following a year of unsuccessful attempts, the couple made the decision to seek medical assistance for their infertility issues. To identify the true source of the issue, doctors will perform a variety of tests. As for the Bryson couple, it turned out that Richard and Angela had some problems of their own, making it unlikely that they would conceive naturally. Nevertheless, their chances of becoming parents would be slim, even with fertility therapy. Angela experienced miscarriages inside the first 12 weeks of her pregnancies on many occasions. The couple suffered from this emotional roller coaster, but they were ready for it, so they kept working on their marriage and consoled one another when disappointment came. Just as the couple was prepared to quit up and accept a childless future, Angela became pregnant. The couple waited until week 14 of pregnancy to see their doctor because their prior pregnancies ended after 12 weeks. They received a fantastic news that morning. They were expecting twins. In an effort to reduce her exposure to danger and take the best possible care of her body, Angela quit her work. To give her infants the best chance of surviving to full term, she would maintain a nutritious diet, get as much rest as she could, and stay away from stress. The ensuing months weren't entirely stress-free, though. The couple visited the local hospital on a regular basis for examinations. The doctor on call would help you during the birthing process because this hospital used a rotating system. Despite the excellent qualifications of the medical personnel, it was a little challenging to not have a single doctor who was responsible for monitoring your pregnancy development. About 30 weeks into the pregnancy, Angela experienced severe stomach cramps when she woke up one morning. She begged Richard to take her to the hospital after waking him up. She was afraid she was going into early labor since she had never felt such anguish. Anguish permeated the minutes that followed for Richard and Angela. The couple arrived at the hospital right before the conclusion of the night shift. Dr. Tim Malone was seen by Richard and Angela in a consulting room, looking rather exhausted and disoriented. The physician had just returned from a lengthy procedure that had left him worn out and upset. After inquiring about Angela's symptoms, he just listened to the 2 infant girls' heartbeats using a stethoscope. He also patted her round tummy and told her that she was merely having Braxton Hicks contractions and nothing more serious was wrong. This was the body's method of preparing for giving birth. The session lasted for 10 minutes, after which Angela was given a prescription for painkillers that were safe to use while pregnant and sent on her way. Richard and Angela were unhappy with the way they were treated that morning, despite the fact that they did not cause a disturbance. Richard couldn't get the uneasy sensation that Angela was dealing with something more severe, something that may affect his unborn children. He couldn't get rid of the sense that the doctor ought to have performed some more tests to make sure everything was in working condition. After returning home, the pair took Angela's prescription medicine. The symptoms went away and the cramping were more tolerable after a day. After researching Braxton Hicks contractions, Angela came to the conclusion that the doctor had given the correct diagnosis. In the ensuing week, Richard managed to finalize the arrangements for the twin daughters' delivery. Before bringing home the miracle kids for which this couple had been waiting for over a decade, the baby room needed to be finished, and a few items needed to be purchased. Angela only planned to have a C-section in an emergency. She wanted to give birth naturally. Angela experienced minor contractions once again when the pregnancy reached 40 weeks, but she was still unable to go into labor. After a brief trip to the hospital, it was determined that labor would most likely start in the following 24 hours, and that an inducement would be necessary. If it did not, Angela was transferred to the hospital early the next morning to give birth to the twins. For the Brysons, this was a pivotal time in their life. They would be blessed with twins after waiting so long for a child. Even at 30 weeks, Richard still felt anxious about their arrival, even if he didn't want to express his worry to Angela. He had a strange feeling that Dr. Malone had overlooked something that would have fatal consequences for his children. Was what happened that morning a result of faith or coincidence? Dr. Malone was the physician assigned to the delivery as soon as Richard and Angela arrived at the hospital. Following an examination and preparation for induction procedures, Dr. Malone ultimately chose to perform a C-section after observing the infant's heartbeats. The kids appeared to be in distress, even if it wasn't urgent, so it was preferable to deliver the girls right away. Lanny and Laura were born an hour after the couple arrived at the hospital. Despite their diminutive size, the girls appeared to be in good health. The physician requested that the nurses check on everyone's well-being. After he was finished with Angela, Dr. Malone exited the theater with a bewildered and rather troubled expression on his face. Richard's actions may have been motivated by instinct or panic, but the father of the two little girls asked the nurses to do some more tests because he was worried about their well-being. The nurses were first apprehensive since the doctor had warned them not to do any unusual operations, but Richard persisted and informed them he would cover any more costs as long as his kids had the finest care possible. Richard felt very much the weight of the following hour as Angela continued to recover from anesthetic. He was bearing his peculiar load for his little daughters and was unable to pinpoint the specific source of his worry. After Angela had recovered, the two little girls were taken to their parents that evening. However, the babies weren't brought by the nurses. Rather, Dr. Tim Malone arrived in the room as the two infants were snuggled into a cot. The doctor was obviously experiencing some sort of mental anguish. Richard and Angela were really concerned about this because they thought the doctor would break some unpleasant news. The doctor was silent for a long moment before he spoke. He said, eyes welling with sorrow, that he ought to have performed a more complete assessment when Angela first complained of stomach cramps at 30 weeks along. He would have discovered the bacterial illness she had acquired if he had performed more testing. Luckily, the females were mostly unaffected by this virus, which may have caused harm to the infants. They were able to treat the twins right away since the father's extra tests, which were done, verified the illness. If Richard hadn't pushed on the testing, they wouldn't have found it. The girls were given medicine, the doctor added, to guarantee that any potential effects of the bacterial infection would be prevented. The doctor acknowledged that he was overworked and stressed out following the procedure, but that this was still no justification and that he ought to have paid more attention to the couple's worries. Richard and Angela made the difficult decision to overlook the doctor's carelessness. Ultimately, their children were thriving, and earlier that day, Dr. Malone had delivered the babies safely. Dr. Malone first took up Lanny and hugged her, tears in his eyes. Then he lifted Laura and embraced her against his chest. With tears streaming down his face, he said, "Please forgive me." While Laura was bubbling away, Dr. Malone could clearly hear her say, "I forgive you." It was obvious that the doctor was speaking from a guilty conscience. Yet this was the relief the doctor needed to forgive himself for any carelessness with the twin girls. Ultimately, everything turned out well for Dr. Malone and the Bryson family. Have you ever had a doctor misdiagnose you? If you had been Richard or Angela, would you also have been able to forgive Dr. Malone?